So, this is what the new generation are told 40 years after the Exodus. And they're told that when they go into the new land, they got to destroy all the inhabitants. And this is one of these things that isn't popular today. It's not very politically correct. So let's just look at a couple of Bible verses to see why they're supposed to destroy the other nations, right? Years before, back in Genesis chapter 15, when God visited Abraham, okay, so this is, what's this, like 400 years earlier? He says, in the fourth generation, Genesis 15 verse 16, in the fourth generation your descendants will return here. He's talking about the promised land. And he says, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its limit. Now the Amorites were some of the people living in the land of Canaan. And what God's saying is, he's saying, Abraham, I'm going to bring your descendants into the land, into the promised land, but not yet. The reason why I'm not going to do it yet is because the Amorites are living there at the moment and their sin has not reached its full measure yet. But in round about 400 years' time, the Amorites would have committed so many terrible sins that it's time for me to say, you guys are out. I've waited and you have not repented and now you are going to be destroyed. So we see that part of the Israelites coming into the land of Canaan and destroying the people there, part of it is God's punishment to these people for their sins. Now, clearly the New Testament does not teach that we Christians today are supposed to do that. We are not supposed to go and shoot, stab, whatever, non-Christians and say it's the judgment of God. Instead, we read in the New Testament that Jesus is going to come back one day and he's going to destroy his enemies. We don't battle against flesh and blood, as it says in Ephesians. So we're not called to do this today, but back then at this time, God's people were actually called to destroy God's enemies. And God is God, he can do what he wants. Now there's a second reason why they had to destroy the people who lived in the land of Canaan. And it's in Deuteronomy 7 verse 4. Where they're warned here to not marry any of the people. You know, like there's some pretty girls in the land, don't let your sons marry them. It says, because if you do, it says, for they will turn your sons away from me to worship other gods. So the idea is that if they don't destroy the people in the land of Canaan, then what's going to happen is that the blokes are going to meet these women and say, these are nice women. And then the women are going to turn them away from Yahweh. And they're going to end up worshipping other gods. And sadly, this is what happened many years later with Solomon. But we'll come to that in a few weeks. So the idea is they've got to destroy the inhabitants of the land so that you can have God's rule over God's people in God's place. And they take over the land. They take over the land under the leading of Joshua. And the land is then divided up into tribal allocations. So the 12 tribes of Israel is divided up. It's a bit complicated actually how it's divided up, but we don't need to look into that right now. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. This is a good place. In a way, it's a bit like the Garden of Eden all over again. And remember, the idea is that living in this place, Israel is going to be a blessing to all the other nations. Because the other nations are going to look at Israel and see, wow, these are God's people in God's place under God's rule. I want to live like that too. That's the idea. As you read through the Bible, you see that isn't what happens, sadly. And Joshua asked them in Joshua 24:15, he says, choose today who you will serve. And you've kind of got this question mark where you're thinking, who are the Israelites going to serve? Are they going to serve God in the land, or are they going to end up worshipping other gods, rejecting God, and then get kicked out of the land? So now the question is, how does all this business about the land, the promised land, how does this point to Christ? If you remember, on the road to Emmaus, Jesus is chatting to those two disciples, and he shows them how the Old Testament all points to him. And we've seen this before in the past, that we're reading the Old Testament. We have to not just stop with the Old Testament context, but also see, how does this point to Christ? And so what we need to do is read now Hebrews chapter 3 verse 7 to Hebrews chapter 4 verse 16. So Hebrews chapter 3 verse 7 to the end of Hebrews chapter 4. So if you're watching this on video now, you want to do that now. Okay, so how does this point to Christ now that we've all read Hebrews chapter 3 verse 7 to the end of Hebrews chapter 4? We actually did that before we started filming. Okay, first thing, entering the promised land is like entering God's rest. Entering the promised land is like entering God's rest. If you remember, to when we started this course, we saw how when God made the world, he made the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested. And there's something special about God's rest, the idea of God's rest being a time where God's people can enjoy harmonious relationship with God and with one another. And that's what was supposed to happen. You know, the Garden of Eden, human beings then live harmoniously with God and one another for all eternity. They keep eating of the they keep eating of the fruit of the tree of life, and they can live forever in God's rest. And then we saw Noah turn up, because obviously people mess it up and they don't live in God's rest. Noah turns up, and his name sounds like the Hebrew word for rest. And Noah's dad's like, yeah, great, through my boy, people might get rest at last. And you see a new beginning start with Noah. And we saw a new beginning, it's a bit like the creation story with the water. And then you've got how God, well, we won't go into it again, but it's like you get a new creation story. But then you see everything goes pear-shaped again. So it's like, oh, we're not in God's rest. Now, at this stage of the story, you've got God's people brought out of slavery, and God says you can come into the promised land. And the idea is that they would be coming into God's rest, and they can live as God's people in God's place under God's rule, and have harmonious relationships with one another and with God. Hence the law he gave them, because the law, the 10 Commandments, helps them to have harmonious relationship with God and with one another. That's why you can't lie to your neighbour, because you've got to have harmonious relationships with one another as well. That's why the law is summed up in loving God and loving your neighbour. So when we read Hebrews, we see that in the New Testament they're saying, the writer of Hebrews is saying that those guys back then, when they had the opportunity to go into the promised land, they had the opportunity to enter God's rest. And us people today, when we put our trust in Jesus Christ, we can enter God's rest. And that's something we can enjoy right now, trusting in Jesus Christ. But it's also something that will be consummated at the end when Christ comes back and we live with God for all eternity and have harmonious relationships with one another and with God. But just like those people got saved out of slavery in Egypt and then refused to enter God's rest, in the same way we can actually be people who get saved from our past lives. Like some people, they get saved from a life of drug addiction, but then they don't. At first they say, yeah, Jesus is great, but they don't keep on trusting in Jesus. They don't keep having faith in Jesus, and they end up being like the Israelites who were like, no, we don't trust that we can go into the promised land. We're scared of the people there. They didn't have faith in God. They didn't have faith in God's promises. In the same way, there's people today that then don't put their faith in Jesus Christ, and they don't enter God's rest at the end. Which means we've got to be people that keep on clinging to Christ every day. And that's why we've seen people along the way. You see them get saved from their previous lifestyle, and you see the help they get from the church, and you're like, wow, this is amazing. And then you see them drop off, and then you find they're not interested in Jesus anymore. It's just like the people who refused to enter the promised land and ended up in the desert for 40 years. Which is why we Christians today can't be saying, yeah, I got saved 10 years ago, I went up the front and everything's cool. Instead we've got to say, I'm going to keep clinging to Jesus every day, trusting in Jesus Christ, trusting in his sacrifice. We've got to keep clinging to him every day so that we enter God's rest at the end. So entering the promised land is like entering God's rest. That's the first thing.